In this video, I'd like to review assessing student learning. There are three broad types of assessment. These are diagnostic, formative, and summative, and I'd like to review each of these very briefly. So diagnostic assessments take place before instruction begins, and they're used to check students' prior knowledge and skill level. What do students know about the material? What are some of their misconceptions? What are they interested in? What are their learning preferences? Diagnostic assessments provide information to assist teacher planning and guide differentiated instruction. So differentiated instruction means that different students will be at different levels of competence. For example, you may have students with practical knowledge but not theoretical knowledge. So they worked in this field but they don't know the theoretical underpinnings. Conversely, you may have students with theoretical knowledge but no practical knowledge. So those different student populations in the same class would require differentiated instruction. Diagnostic assessment would reveal those differences. Diagnostic assessments are usually not graded because you're not grading them on something you've taught them. You're trying to evaluate what it is they already know, like what's their starting point. So some examples are prior knowledge and skills checks or interest and learning preference surveys. Formative assessments happen during instruction. So they're used to provide specific feedback to teachers and students for the purpose of guiding teaching and improving learning. Formative assessments help me as a teacher to understand if what I'm doing is working. Formative assessments, like diagnostic assessments, are usually not graded. And examples include both formal and informal methods, such as quizzing. So you can give students quizzes at the end of each sort of chunk of your content, but you can give them multiple attempts. So I'm using this quiz as a signal for you to either keep doing what you're doing if you perform well on the quiz, or reevaluate what you're doing as a learner if you're not doing well on the quiz. But the quizzes are for you, the learner, to signal you about your learning practices. Oral questioning, observing students perform a particular task or demonstrate their learning. Drafts. So let's say that you have a large report that's due sometime toward the end of the semester. You might assess their ability to create this report in stages. What's your topic? What are your questions? Let me take a look at your outline. Let me give you feedback on your first draft. So all of those are formative assessments. Students can also construct concept maps, learning logs. You can review their portfolio. Formatively, I'm attempting to understand the student's formation of their knowledge and competency. Summative assessments happen after instruction, and they're used to summarize what students have learned at the conclusion of a chunk of your course. So the midterm is an example of a summative assessment. They're graded, and familiar examples of these kinds of assessments are tests, final exams, culminating projects. Summative assessments command the attentions of students and really of instructors because their results typically count, right? They're weighted very heavily. So what are some considerations of assessment? Well, based on what we've talked about so far, we know that 2 of the 3 types of assessment are not graded. So we have a tendency, I think, to think of assessment as really summative, right? It's a test that ends in a grade. We can use assessment to really provide feedback to students about their learning behaviors. Waiting until the end of a teaching period to find out how well students have learned might be too late. Assessment should also be aligned with the instruction and not based upon assumptions of what students know. For example, let's imagine that I'm asking my students to give a final presentation, but I haven't really talked through with them what a good presentation is. What are effective presentation strategies? I'm not a professor of communication, so I'm not teaching how to give presentations. I'm a chemistry professor. I'm interested in chemistry. The issue there is that the assessment may not be aligned with the instruction. I'm asking the students to demonstrate their knowledge in a way that I haven't taught them how to demonstrate. That's almost like asking them to bake a cake. The connection between cake baking and what I've taught them all semester may be obscure to them. What types of assessments do you most often use in your teaching? The assessment students use as they develop, practice, and learn should be based on the same knowledge and skills they will ultimately demonstrate for a grade. Context is often really important. So we want to make sure that there are clear connections between student learning and student assessment of that learning. So we want to use summative assessments to frame meaningful performance goals. Well, let's say that I want the students to write a paper at the end of the semester. At the beginning of the semester, I can give the students a sample final paper, and we can talk about it. What are the qualities of this paper? Is it an effective paper? Why or why not? What is the paper? How is the paper structured? How long is it? What kind of language is being used? So this is helpful for students to understand exactly what they're going to be asked to produce. And so they can bear that in mind as they're proceeding through the semester. Assessment should also be authentic. An assessment is authentic when it requires that students engage with real-life problems, issues, or tasks for an audience who cares about or has a stake in what students learn. These kinds of authentic tasks enable students to make sense of and apply what they've learned and to establish clear connections between what they've learned in class and the world they live in. We also want to consider, what are the stakes of the assessment? Are all of the assessments in our courses high stakes? Is it just like a midterm and a final, and I have 2 opportunities to demonstrate my learning as a student? Or are there many opportunities of much lower stakes that I can demonstrate what I know and are more related to my development along a particular continuum of knowledge rather than a snapshot of where I am at one particular place in time? We want to, as we noted in our paper discussion, show criteria and models in advance. Assess before we teach. I'm not saying we shouldn't assess during and after, but assessing before we teach really helps determine where the students are, what their preferences are, what their skill levels are, what's their prior knowledge. We want to offer students appropriate choices around assessment to give them opportunities to demonstrate their knowledge that we may have not considered, but they may want to use. So is a paper the only way? Is a short answer exam the only way I can demonstrate my knowledge? Are there no other choices for me? We want to provide feedback early and often so that students know to continue engaging in their learning behaviors or to change those learning behaviors because they're working or not working. We want to encourage students to self-assess and to set their own goals. So let's imagine you had students take a look at their post on a discussion board and determine whether or not they've been making effective posts. What does effective contribution look like? How can I apply that rubric of effective contribution to my own contributions in class? It's really important to allow new evidence of achievement to replace old evidence. Students need to know that I can do better. This is called ipsative assessment, and that compares current student performance to past performance. It traces their development. So at the beginning of the course, the expectations around student learning are very different than they are toward the end of the course. And as a learner in a course, I should know that, well, just because I was kind of slow out of the gate, I didn't really understand this at the beginning, that's not going to hurt me for the entire semester. Because I didn't perform well on one assessment doesn't mean I can't get an A. So this is connected to the idea of learned helplessness. Learned helplessness is a condition in which a person suffers from a sense of powerlessness arising from a traumatic event or persistent failure to succeed. So someone who says, I'm just not a math person, that's an example of learned helplessness. A student who expresses that they're not a math person, they may have low self-esteem as it relates to math. They may have experienced chronic failure, sadness, even physical illness. They may have real deep aversions to a particular subject, not to pick on math. And so we need to kind of understand that in diagnostic assessment. Self-efficacy is the belief a person holds regarding their power to affect situations. So this is really powerful in learning contexts. So if I give my students a bunch of opportunities to demonstrate learning and to be successful, that improves their self-efficacy. They become more invested in subjects that they feel that they're doing well in. So I need to provide the students with opportunities to do well. We want to ask ourselves, why am I assessing? What am I assessing? Am I assessing my teaching? Am I assessing student learning? Is it some combination of both? Are students given the space to self-assess? Do self-assessments matter? Do they count? I'm sharing these citations with you for further reading if you're interested. So these are some real foundational texts when we think about assessing student learning, learned helplessness, and so on. If you have any questions, please feel free to email me at d'agostino@fordham.edu. Thanks very much.